I married my husband Van, who's 36, only recently. I'm 32, and we'd been together for 4 years before getting engaged for 8 months. When I first met him, I was 29 and working as a manager in a bar, where he was a regular customer. He would show up again and again, always managing to find reasons to chat. Initially, I turned him down when he asked me out, but my co-workers teased me about how relentlessly sweet he was, and I realized I was growing curious about him. One day, something inside me just said, give this guy a chance, and that's how our story began. I fell for his considerate nature, his mature way of handling things, and I admired that he was financially independent. He had an incredible knack for planning the most perfect dates. However, from the start, there was a single point of tension, his mother, Naomi. In the early days, I really did like his mother. She seemed caring, and I wanted us to be on good terms. Van had been 13 when his parents separated. His dad, Matt, had an affair with a female co-worker, breaking Naomi's heart. Matt begged for forgiveness, trying to explain that in a moment of recklessness, he lost sight of his values. Naomi, however, refused to even consider staying together, and the two divorced. You can imagine it was extremely painful for her, and Van, being just a young teen, was emotionally torn. He lived with his mother on weekdays, so he could go to school, and spent weekends with his dad. Despite his mistake, Matt remained a supportive father. He never missed Van's sports events, teacher conferences, or special milestones. He was the kind of dad who gave Van room to be himself, which Van really appreciated. Naomi, in contrast, grew overly strict. Whether it was a lingering distrust, because of Matt's infidelity, or her desperation to keep Van close, she established a whole list of rigid rules that Van had to obey. As Van opened up to me about this, he shared the long list of what was off-limits for him. He couldn't be out late with friends, he couldn't go on class trips, and he was absolutely prohibited from spending time near lakes or beaches. He also wasn't allowed to date, or go to any sleepovers. At first, I almost laughed at the absurdity of those rules, but Van explained that in Naomi's mind, she was shielding him from a harsh world. She'd tell him she was lonely without him, and was merely protecting him from potential harm. Van gradually realized that staying with his dad felt more liberating. Matt asked only for a reasonable curfew, and wanted to be kept informed of Van's location, mostly to ensure his safety. Whenever a school trip was coming up, Naomi would forbid Van from going, and Matt would sneakily enroll him. This sparked heated confrontations between Matt and Naomi, including threats of court battles. When Van wanted to hang out with friends, Naomi would flat out refuse. So Van's strategy was to wait until the weekend to be with his dad, where he could finally relax, see his buddies, or attend concerts. Once Van reached his teenage years, his disputes with Naomi amplified. She judged his clothing choices, haircuts, and the people he hung out with. He felt so stifled that he'd often lock himself in his room, counting down the days until the weekend arrived so he could escape to his dad's. Then, at 17, Van met Heather, Matt's new wife. Heather had always longed for a child but struggled with fertility issues and believed she'd never become a mother. Meeting Matt, discovering that he had a teenage son, and getting to know Van was like an unexpected gift. She treated Van kindly and genuinely, and they formed a sweet bond. Naomi, however, couldn't abide by the idea of another maternal figure entering her son's life. She tried to turn Van against Heather, going so far as to claim Matt had been cheating on her with this new woman before the divorce. It simply wasn't true. Heather had only come along years after the split. Still, Naomi refused to accept it. She began to weaponize custody, preventing Matt from seeing Van, which left Van lonely and frustrated. On weekends when Van should have been excited to see his dad, Naomi put her foot down, insisting she wouldn't let her son stay around strangers, especially another woman. This all culminated in fiery arguments, but Naomi remained unyielding. Finally, when Van turned 18, he had 2 university acceptance letters. Naomi did her best to pressure him into choosing the closer school, so she could drive to see him regularly. Van hated the idea, because the program there lacked resources in his field. He had a heart-to-heart conversation with Matt, who encouraged him to choose the university he truly wanted, even if it upset Naomi. Despite being afraid of disappointing her, Van ultimately picked the faraway university, triggering a spectacular meltdown from Naomi. She declared that all men were disloyal, that her own son was abandoning her, and she threatened to withdraw her financial support. In a rage, she told him he had to leave her home if he defied her. Panicking, Van phoned his father for help, and Matt promptly arrived, helping him move out. The last image Van had before they drove away was Naomi screaming vulgarities at him and Matt from the doorway. Van entered college with a mix of sorrow and relief. Matt helped cover some of the tuition, and Van took out a modest student loan. But during that first stretch of college, Van stayed out of contact with Naomi. She sent him a flurry of texts daily, alternating between apologies and accusations, pinning all her life's failures on him. Van admitted to me that he still loved his mom, but needed distance for peace of mind. Meanwhile, Matt kept in touch and invited Van to spend the holidays with him. Then, in his sophomore year, Van received an alarming call. Naomi had attempted to end her own life. Horrified, Van immediately contacted Matt, and both raced to the hospital. Naomi was kept for a 72-hour observation. Doctors diagnosed her with bipolar disorder and depression. This devastating revelation shattered Van's heart, plunging him into overwhelming guilt. He felt as though he was at fault. He spent hours by her side, asking for her forgiveness, watching over her in the hospital bed, and praying for her recovery. Once Naomi was discharged, she was prescribed specific medications. Van vowed never to abandon her again. After finishing college, he settled back in his hometown so he could be close to her. Though he maintained his own apartment, he made sure he was only a short drive away. Naomi took full advantage of this guilt-driven devotion. Van appeared chronically tense, riddled with anxiety, perpetually worried about how his mother would handle even the smallest matters. He was afraid of challenging her or leaving her alone. When Van confided all this in me, I felt genuine empathy. I understood that she had serious mental health issues, and I believed her ongoing therapy would help. But as time wore on, I sensed something less constructive. It wasn't just Naomi's condition. She had a habit of making jabs at me, teasing me about my weight, my complexion, or hinting that a child of Van's should inherit his fairer skin, insinuating I wasn't good enough. She'd comment that Van deserved someone more attractive, or was settling with me for reasons she couldn't comprehend. It stung, but I tried ignoring it, reassuring myself it was her grief and her worldview, not a reflection of my worth. Nevertheless, her interference started severely affecting Van and me. Naomi called him each morning, demanding to know if he'd eaten breakfast. Missing even one call led to a storm of repeated attempts until he finally answered. Once I moved in with Van, she'd sometimes dial my number too, accusing me of blocking her access to her son. There were numerous instances where Van abruptly cancelled dates or left events because Naomi rang him, alleging she wasn't feeling well. He would run to her side, torn between wanting a normal life and fearing she might do something drastic again. At his office's award ceremonies, if Van had a +1, Naomi insisted it be her. She'd guilt him, complaining I was stealing his attention. When we planned weekend getaways, she demanded Van's location be shared at all times. Honestly, it was smothering. I recognized Van's struggle. He was paralyzed by dread that if he didn't comply, something might happen. Simultaneously, Matt, in contrast, was laid back and open-hearted. Whenever we hung out with Matt and Heather, it felt welcoming and liberating. Matt's warmth was reflected in Van, a testament to the kindness I saw behind Van's eyes, which is why I stayed with him despite these issues. I knew that therapy might help him, but whenever I tried coaxing him to go, he'd brush it aside, insisting he was fine. Then, out of nowhere, Van proposed. I was completely surprised. He even invited my best friend and my parents to be there for the special day, which made it magical. Matt and Heather attended too, showering us with congratulations. Naomi, however, was notably absent, and I discovered it was because she was supposedly feeling under the weather. To be honest, a part of me was relieved she didn't show up. It spared us any awkwardness in front of my parents, and I could genuinely enjoy the moment. But this euphoria was short-lived. During our post-engagement celebration, Van got an urgent call from the hospital, telling him that Naomi had fallen down a flight of stairs. We all rushed over, bracing ourselves for the worst. Yet, at the hospital, Naomi insisted on seeing Van alone, refusing to let me or anyone else step into her room. It irritated me that she shut us out, considering we had all come out of concern. But I didn't want to make a scene in the hospital. Van emerged, saying she'd fractured something and would have to stay overnight. Naomi demanded he remain in her room. Matt offered to stay instead so Van could be with his new fiancée, but Van refused, saying his mother wouldn't like it, and it could cause more drama. That night, my parents and best friend tried comforting me at my apartment, but I was deflated. I was thrilled to be engaged, yet he spent that pivotal night beside his mother, who obviously resented me. Wedding preparations were just as stressful. Naomi criticized every aspect of the ceremony, my choice of bridal gown, the venue, the guest list, and even which flower girl we should pick. She insisted that Van's wedding suit had to reflect some style she chose. When it came to our honeymoon, Van and I had dreamed about Hawaii for ages, but Naomi was adamantly against it, calling it a pointless long-distance trip. That was the final straw for me. I told her we would not compromise. This was our honeymoon, and we deserved to pick the location. She acted horrified, lecturing me about how rude I was being, as though she expected me to cater to her every whim. She cried to Van, accusing me of excluding her, complaining that I wanted to keep her son away. I pointed out that I had already gone along with plenty of her wishes, from the officiant, to certain cake options, to suggestions for my bridesmaids' dresses, just to keep her happy. She responded with more tears, painting me as selfish. Even though I was exasperated, I still sent a text to apologize for being too blunt, primarily because Van loved her and I wanted to keep the peace. Her reply, "No woman can take my son from me. Know your place." I showed that message to Van immediately, who telephoned his mother. She claimed I was attempting to sabotage their bond and insisted he must always trust her more than me. When the call ended, Van actually admitted that she was out of line. That comforted me a bit, and he promised we would go to Hawaii, just like we had decided from the beginning. Our wedding day arrived, and we managed to make it through with only minor annoyances. Of course, Naomi took it upon herself to deliver a speech that mainly revolved around her personal sacrifices and hardships, overshadowing the fact that this day should have been all about her son and me. Although it stung, I tried my best to remain composed, focusing on the fact that Van and I would soon be escaping to Hawaii for our long-awaited honeymoon. My parents, Matt, Heather, and all our friends enjoyed themselves, dancing late into the night, and I tried to carry only the joyful memory of that evening. The morning of our trip, I was brimming with excitement. Van and I got ready and headed to the airport. But the moment we got there, I discovered he'd booked a business class ticket for himself and given me an economy seat. I was left speechless. If it came down to paying extra, I could have chipped in to ensure we sat together. Van had urged me from the start to trust him with the entire honeymoon plan. I assumed that meant booking seats side by side. But he mumbled something about a last-minute deal, and how my seat couldn't be upgraded too. He refused to look me in the eye, which only heightened my suspicion. He repeatedly said it was just a short flight, so it shouldn't matter. I told him if it was so unimportant, then he could take my economy seat and let me have the business class one. He accused me of overreacting, saying we could talk about it after we landed in Hawaii. Then he announced he was heading to the business lounge to wait before boarding. I felt a knot in my throat. Part of me wanted to rage, but another part was terrified. Why was he being so shady? Alone in the waiting area, I grew more upset. I tried calling him several times, and each attempt went unanswered. Suddenly, my phone rang. It was Naomi. I immediately braced myself, because she rarely called me personally unless it was to pester me about connecting her to Van. She asked where I was, but she already knew the answer. We were leaving for our honeymoon. She started prying for specifics. Was I near such and such cafe, or close to the lounge? I was already on edge, so I bluntly asked what she wanted. In her usual mocking tone, she told me not to lose my temper, but she was joining us on our honeymoon. I was so enraged that I practically shouted, demanding if she was kidding. She explained that she couldn't stand the idea of Van traveling so far from her, so she'd convinced him to include her. I hung up without another word, absolutely livid. I marched directly to the business lounge. The security guard, of course, tried to turn me away, but I told him I needed to speak with my husband urgently. He wasn't answering his phone, and it involved a crisis about his mother. After much pleading, they escorted me in. I spotted Van scrolling through his phone, looking utterly casual, which told me he'd been ignoring my calls intentionally. I approached him, and he looked mortified to see me. Trying to maintain some composure, I confronted him on whether it was true Naomi was coming to Hawaii. His face turned crimson. He stammered, telling me he booked flights for the three of us, because Naomi wouldn't stop crying and begging. He said this was the only way to keep both of us happy, by hiding that fact from me. He'd given her a separate hotel, apparently so I wouldn't find out. As he tried to justify himself, Naomi appeared, scanning the lounge. When she laid eyes on us, she froze. She strutted over, gloating about how I should be pleased that her son loved her so deeply. She brushed off my distress, insisting it wasn't a big deal if she tagged along. My body was shaking with fury. I wanted to scream in her face or yank at her hair, but I restrained myself. Instead, I let my temper get the best of me in words. I shouted that Van was basically her spouse, not her son, and that I was disgusted with him for deceiving me this way. Van whispered at me to calm down, because the lounge was filled with important, wealthy travelers. He wanted us to continue this conversation in private once we were in Hawaii. I laughed bitterly and told him he could enjoy Hawaii with his real partner, his mother. I tore my ticket and stormed out, not caring who stared. Sure enough, Van ended up not boarding either. He came home, furious, scolding me for humiliating him in front of strangers. He believed he'd done what he had to do and told me Naomi was forced to go alone, because she didn't want the ticket to be wasted. I locked myself in the bathroom and cried, feeling utterly broken. This incident happened just the day before. Now, I'm in a haze, barely able to process that my marriage is likely doomed. Van isn't asking for my forgiveness, and we aren't speaking. It's devastating, considering only 3 days ago, I was over the moon at the idea of a shared life with him. And here I am, on Reddit, questioning if I'm in the wrong for walking out on my husband after he chose to bring his mother on our honeymoon. Update 1. I appreciate the supportive responses and private messages. People have pointed out that I should have one last heartfelt conversation with Van. If he continues to defend Naomi's actions, I won't have any alternative but to file for divorce, because I refuse to battle this same issue over and over. Naomi obviously doesn't care about the turmoil she caused, given she boarded the plane anyway. I'll let everyone know what happens after I attempt one final talk with him. Update 2. A month has gone by since my last update, and it's been a whirlwind. I decided I couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer, and prepared to speak openly with Van when he got back from work one evening. I packed some things, unsure if the conversation might lead to me leaving for good. When he walked in, he spotted my luggage and looked startled, but I calmly asked him to sit, offering him water. We hadn't said much to each other since the airport disaster. He was clearly anticipating a fight, but I wanted him to hear me fully first. Taking a deep breath, I spelled out how Naomi's behavior had been affecting me since the very beginning. I explained that each time she intruded, he'd shift into someone else, someone fearful, guilty, and over-accommodating. I told him I recognized he was weighed down by the notion that he owed Naomi everything, because of her mental health and her repeated pleas for pity. My tears spilled over as I described how her constant meddling had drained my emotional energy, from our wedding planning all the way to the honeymoon fiasco. It pained me to recount it, but it was crucial for him to grasp how deeply I felt betrayed. Van started crying. That shook me, because he rarely showed such naked emotion. He admitted he was clueless about how persistently hurt I'd been. He confessed he'd lived so long feeling obligated to fix Naomi's life, that he couldn't break out of the cycle. She'd guilt him his entire childhood, and it spilled into adulthood. He revealed that he realized how wrong he'd been to involve her in our honeymoon, but in the moment, he panicked and chose what seemed like an easier path, lying to me just so he wouldn't have to upset his mother. I then emphasized that if Naomi truly wanted to be near him, she would have cancelled her trip after everything imploded, not gone gallivanting to Hawaii anyway. He nodded solemnly, explaining he recognized her manipulations too late, after the damage was done. Suddenly, he dropped to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably, apologizing over and over. My anger softened as I realized how deeply he was suffering. He needed professional guidance, and I loved him enough to see if he could change. So we embraced, and I said I was willing to give our marriage a chance if he was truly committed to getting help. Over the next couple of weeks, Van scheduled his first therapy appointment. He also talked with his father, Matt, who was shocked at Naomi's antics and said Van shouldn't live in constant fear of her. Van's therapist helped him realize that he needed to reduce contact with Naomi for the sake of his own mental health. But it was a tough move, because Naomi blew up his phone each day. He was dreading breaking this news to her, fearing she'd become unhinged. He decided he would tell her he needed space, and if she refused, blocking her would be the only option. Despite the pain, it was a necessary step for us to salvage our relationship. I genuinely felt we had a chance now, and that Van was finally prioritizing our well-being. There was a spark of optimism in our marriage that we hadn't felt in a long time. Update 3. 3 months have slipped by since that pivotal moment, and I'm grateful for everyone who followed this saga and offered words of support. It's been a dramatic journey, but I'm pleased to share some positive developments. First, Van did have a serious conversation with Naomi, explaining he was in therapy and establishing boundaries. Predictably, she erupted, hurling accusations, flinging blame at me, and demanding he should divorce me because apparently I'm tearing mother and son apart. But Van held firm. He declared he would no longer tolerate her manipulation or her attempts to guilt him. She refused to listen, so he made the difficult choice to block her number. I did the same. She then started reaching out to other relatives, telling tales of abandonment. Gossip traveled back to us, but we tried to ignore it. Meanwhile, Matt has quietly been checking in on Naomi, ensuring she's maintaining her medication schedule and doing okay. Although we've distanced ourselves, Van has found it easier to breathe. That perpetual weight he carried, the constant fear of her next emotional outburst, is gone. We've started having date nights, where we can focus on each other without the phone blasting with calls from Naomi. It's a night and day difference in our relationship. Finally, Van decided to surprise me with a proper honeymoon in Hawaii. This time, we both flew business class, side by side, and had the tranquil, romantic trip we'd initially planned. There were no arguments, no frantic phone calls, just the two of us rediscovering the happiness that first brought us together. I can truly say that the relationship feels healthier now. That's not to say everything is magically perfect. There's still a sense of loss for Van, because cutting ties with his mother is bittersweet. But the way he's grown, and the way he's putting us first, makes me hopeful for our future. If there are any new major developments, I'll be sure to let everyone know.